5 nighttime habits that enlarge the prostate after 60 and how to avoid them for better sleep. Solution to other people's problems was now becoming the problem that needed solving. Robert found himself caught between aging with dignity and the growing realization that his stubborn independence might be hurting the people he loved most. Sarah had started making subtle accommodations, keeping night lights plugged in, moving his reading glasses closer to his chair, even suggesting they sleep in separate beds because of her restless nights. Each gesture of care felt like evidence of his failing. The breaking point came the following Tuesday when Robert overheard Sarah on the phone with their oldest son. "I'm worried about your father," she whispered, thinking Robert was in the shower. "He's not himself lately. I think something's really wrong, but you know how he is about doctors." The pain in her voice cut deeper than any physical discomfort he'd experienced. Standing there, listening to his wife's fears about his health, Robert faced the hardest decision of his retirement years. He could continue protecting everyone from his struggles, or he could finally admit that the 5 habits he developed weren't just affecting his sleep, they were affecting his entire family. Asterisk, what would Robert choose? And when he finally decided to take action, would the solution he discovered be something he could live with, or would it require him to change everything about the evening routines that had become his comfort zone? Asterisk. Robert's decision came in the most unexpected way. The next morning, while sorting through old school files he'd been meaning to organize, he discovered a letter. At 62, Robert had accepted those nightly bathroom trips as just another part of getting older. 3, sometimes 4 times a night, he'd shuffle down the hallway, careful not to wake his wife, Sarah. Just part of life after 60, he'd tell himself, settling back in a bed only to repeat the ritual hours later. But what Robert didn't realize was that 5 simple habits he developed over the years were quietly making everything worse. These weren't dramatic lifestyle changes. They were small, seemingly innocent routines that millions of men his age follow without thinking twice. The turning point came on a Tuesday night when Robert found himself standing in his bathroom at 3 a.m., frustrated and exhausted. As he stared at his reflection in the mirror, something clicked. This wasn't just about aging gracefully anymore. This was about reclaiming his independence, his sleep, and his peace of mind. You see, senior empowerment isn't just about staying active or eating right. Sometimes it's about understanding how the little things we do each evening can either support our bodies or work against them. Robert's journey taught him that life after 60 doesn't have to mean surrendering to every inconvenience that comes with age. Through careful observation and small changes, he discovered which of his nighttime routines were actually enlarging his prostate and disrupting his sleep. The emotional wisdom that comes with our later years taught him something profound. We have more control than we think, even over things that seem inevitable. But here's what Robert learned that surprised him most, and what might change how you think about your own evening routine forever. Asterisk, what was the first habit Robert discovered that was making his nights so difficult? And how did this simple realization open the door to independent living he thought he'd lost forever? Asterisk, the weight of silent struggles. Robert's story didn't begin with that 3 a.m. moment of clarity. It started 2 years earlier, shortly after his retirement from 35 years as a high school history teacher. Life after retirement had painted a different picture than he'd imagined during all those years of planning and saving. He'd expected freedom, travel with Sarah, maybe finally learning to play guitar. Instead, he found himself caught in a quiet battle with his own body that he was too proud to discuss with anyone. Not his doctor, not his closest friends, and certainly not Sarah, who was already worried about her own mother's declining health. The first few months of senior reflection had been peaceful. Robert enjoyed morning coffee on the porch, reading books he'd always meant to get to, and tending to his small vegetable garden. But somewhere along the way, the nighttime interruptions began stealing more than just sleep. They were chipping away at something deeper. His sense of control, his confidence, his feeling of being the strong partner Sarah had always counted on. "I used to be the one who stayed up when the kids were sick," he confided to his reflection that Tuesday morning. "Now I can't even make it through a full night's sleep." The irony wasn't lost on him that finding purpose in retirement had become more challenging when when he was constantly tired. What troubled Robert most wasn't just the physical discomfort. It was watching Sarah pretend not to notice. She developed this habit of staying up later, reading in the living room chair until she was sure he'd settle for the night. Her emotional resilience had always amazed him, but he could see the concern in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. Their evening conversations had grown shorter. Movie nights became less frequent because Robert never knew when he'd need to step out. Even their Sunday drives to visit the grandchildren felt different when he spent the entire trip calculating where the next rest stop might be. The weight of these changes settled on Robert's shoulders like a heavy coat he couldn't take off. He'd raised 3 children, guided countless students through their teenage years, and weathered every storm that 42 years of marriage had brought. Yet here he was, feeling defeated by something as simple as getting a good night's sleep. But that Tuesday night, standing in his bathroom, Robert realized something that would change everything. The habits he developed weren't random. They followed a pattern. And if there was a pattern, maybe there was a solution he'd been missing all along. Asterisk, what pattern did Robert discover in his evening routine? And how would this revelation lead him to understand the 5 habits that were quietly working against him every single night? Asterisk, when pride meets reality. The pattern Robert discovered wasn't what he expected. It wasn't about what he was eating or drinking, though those played a part. It was about the careful choreography he developed to hide his struggles from the people who mattered most. Every evening at 7:30, he'd excuse himself from dinner cleanup to check something in the garage. By 8:15, he positioned himself in his recliner with a book, strategically close to the hallway. These weren't coincidences. They were calculated moves in a game he'd been playing against his own body. The real wake-up call came 3 weeks later during their grandson Tommy's overnight visit. 8-year-old Tommy had always been Robert's shadow, following him around the garden, asking endless questions about everything from baseball cards to why the sky changes colors. But that Friday night, Tommy noticed something Robert thought he'd hidden perfectly. "Grandpa, why do you keep going to the bathroom? Are you sick?" The innocent question hung in the air, like a challenge Robert wasn't prepared to face. Sarah looked up from her crossword puzzle, and in that moment, Robert saw something shift in her expression. Not pity, but a quiet understanding that their unspoken agreement to pretend everything was normal had finally been broken by the honesty of a child. That weekend became a turning point in ways Robert hadn't anticipated. Sarah gently suggested he talk to their family doctor, but her timing felt like pressure rather than support. Their daughter called Sunday evening, and Robert could hear the concern in her voice when she asked how he was really doing. Even Tommy, before heading home, whispered that his mom had told him to take extra good care of Grandpa. The weight of everyone's unspoken worry became heavier than his physical discomfort. These late-life choices weren't just about his health anymore. They were about family dynamics, about maintaining his role as the steady presence everyone had always counted on. The man who had spent decades being the T stopped him cold. It was from David Chun, a former student from 15 years ago, thanking him for saving my life during a particularly difficult period. What struck Robert wasn't just the gratitude, but David's words about learning to ask for help when everything felt impossible. "You taught me that strength isn't about handling everything alone," David had written. "It's about knowing when to reach out and trust the people who care about you." Robert had kept this letter all these years, but somehow forgotten its message when he needed it most. That afternoon, Robert made a phone call that would change everything. Not to his doctor, as Sarah had suggested, but to his younger brother Michael, who lived 2 states away. Michael had always been the one in the family who researched everything, who asked uncomfortable questions, who never accepted "that's just how it is" as an answer. "I need to tell you something," Robert began. And for the first time in months, he laid out everything. The sleepless nights, the careful choreography, the growing distance from Sarah, even Tommy's innocent question. But Michael's response caught him completely off guard. "You know, I went through something similar 3 years ago," Michael said quietly. "I never told anyone because, well, you know how we are, but I learned some things that might help you. It's not just about getting older, Robert. Sometimes it's about the small things we do without thinking." This rediscovery after 60 of his relationship with his brother opened a door Robert hadn't even realized was closed. Michael had researched extensively when facing his own challenges, and he discovered that certain evening habits, things that seemed completely unrelated to prostate health, were actually making everything worse. More importantly, he'd found ways to change them without giving up the comfort and routines that made evening time enjoyable. The thing is, Michael continued, once I understood what was happening, I realized I had more control than I thought. And the best part? Sarah doesn't have to worry anymore, and I don't have to pretend everything's fine when it's not. That conversation sparked something in Robert that he hadn't felt in months. Hope mixed with determination. But it also created a new kind of pressure. If Michael could figure this out, if there really were specific habits that could be changed, then Robert's months of silent suffering might have been unnecessary. The weight of that realization was both liberating and overwhelming. As he hung up the phone, Robert faced a moment that felt like new beginnings and regret all wrapped together. He could finally see a path forward, but it meant admitting to Sarah that he'd been struggling alone when he didn't have to. It meant healing family bonds that had been strained by his stubborn pride. Most challenging of all, it meant being willing to examine and change the 5 evening habits that Michael had identified as the real culprits behind his nighttime struggles. Asterisk, could Robert find the courage to be vulnerable with Sarah after months of protecting her from his worries? And would the 5 habits Michael discovered be simple enough to change? Or would they require Robert to completely reimagine his evening routine? Asterisk. The conversation with Sarah came that evening, but not the way Robert had planned. He'd rehearsed what he wanted to say, how he'd explain his phone call with Michael, how he'd apologize for months of silent worry. Instead, Sarah surprised him by sitting down beside him on the porch swing and simply saying, "I know you talked to Michael today. He called me afterward." Robert's carefully prepared words dissolved. "Sarah, you don't have to explain," she said gently. "I've been waiting for you to be ready to talk about this. I've known something was wrong for months, but I also know you well enough to understand that you needed to find your own way to the solution." This moment of emotional closure wasn't what Robert had expected. He'd been preparing for hurt feelings, for explanations about why he'd kept her in the dark. Instead, he discovered that Sarah's wisdom with age had taught her something he was still learning. That love sometimes means giving someone space to struggle until they're ready to accept help. "Michael told me about the 5 habits," Sarah continued. "And honestly, hearing that there might be simple changes you can make instead of just accepting this as inevitable, that gave me more hope than I've felt in months." The unexpected twist came when Sarah pulled out a small notebook from her pocket. "I've been keeping track," she admitted. "Not to spy on you, but because I was worried and didn't know how to help. I noticed patterns, what you ate for dinner, when you had your evening tea, how you positioned yourself in the chair, even the temperature you kept the bedroom." She handed him a notebook with a sheepish smile. "Turns out I was documenting the exact same things Michael researched." Robert opened the notebook to find weeks of careful observations, written in Sarah's neat handwriting. She'd noticed everything: his pre-dinner snacking routine, his habit of drinking 2 large glasses of water while watching the evening news, the way he'd prop his feet up in the recliner, his ritual of checking all the door locks right before bed, and even how he'd adjusted the bedroom thermostat higher each night, thinking warmth would help him sleep better. "You did all this research," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion, and never said a word. "I was waiting for you to be ready to let me help," Sarah replied. "But I wanted to be prepared when that moment came." This life's turning point after 60 wasn't about Robert's solitary struggle anymore. It was about recognizing that the partnership he and Sarah had built over 4 decades was strong enough to handle vulnerability, patient enough to wait for readiness, and loving enough to prepare for solutions even when they couldn't be discussed yet. As they sat together on that porch swing, Robert realized that his months of protecting Sarah had actually been matched by her months of protecting him, giving him the space to struggle while quietly preparing to be his partner in healing. How would these 5 simple habits, now clearly identified by both Michael's research and Sarah's observations, transform not just Robert's nights, but his understanding of what it truly means to age gracefully with someone you love? 3 months later, Robert woke up naturally at 6:30 a.m., sunlight streaming through the bedroom window. For the first time in over a year, he'd slept through the entire night. Sarah was still beside him, her breathing soft and steady. And for a moment, he just lay there, grateful for the simple miracle of uninterrupted rest. The changes hadn't been dramatic or complicated. Michael's research and Sarah's careful observations had revealed 5 surprisingly simple evening habits that were working against Robert's body. Shifting his larger meal to lunch instead of dinner. Replacing his evening tea ritual with herbal alternatives that didn't affect his system. Adjusting how he positioned himself in his favorite chair to improve circulation. Streamlining his bedtime routine to reduce the anxious checking and rechecking that kept his mind active. And surprisingly, keeping the bedroom cooler rather than warmer, which helped his body settle into deeper sleep. What struck Robert most wasn't just how well the changes worked, but how naturally they fit into their life together. Sarah had become his evening partner in these small adjustments, not as a caregiver, but as a teammate. They discovered that cooking larger lunches together was actually more enjoyable than rushed dinner preparations. Evening walks replaced the restless chair time, giving them space for conversations they'd been missing. The real transformation went deeper than better sleep. Robert had learned something about senior resilience that surprised him. Strength after 60 wasn't about maintaining the exact same routines he'd always followed. It was about being wise enough to recognize when small changes could create big improvements and humble enough to accept help in making those changes. Sarah often mentioned how much she enjoyed their new evening rhythm. "I feel like I got my partner back," she told him one night as they finished their walk around the neighborhood. "Not because you were gone, but because you're not carrying that worry anymore." Tommy noticed too, during his next overnight visit. "Grandpa, you seem different," he observed with the directness that only children possess. "You seem happier." And Robert realized that was exactly right. These life's quiet victories weren't just about physical comfort. They were about reclaiming joy in the small, daily moments that make up a good life. The timeless lessons from this experience rippled beyond just Robert and Sarah. When he finally shared his story with their adult children, he discovered that his willingness to be vulnerable gave them permission to discuss their own health concerns more openly. Their family conversations became richer, more honest, less focused on maintaining perfect appearances, and more centered on supporting each other through life's inevitable changes. Looking back, Robert understood that his months of struggle hadn't been wasted time. They'd been preparation for a deeper kind of partnership with Sarah, a more authentic relationship with his family, and a clearer understanding of what it means to build meaningful days after 60. Sometimes the most profound changes come not from dramatic gestures, but from the courage to examine the small habits that shape our daily lives and the wisdom to adjust them when they no longer serve us well. The real gift wasn't just sleeping through the night. It was learning that growing older with grace means staying curious, staying connected, and staying open to the possibility that our best chapters might still be ahead of us. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of something in your own life, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe in Nkaf Wisdomy World. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your wisdom and stories matter. Join us every week as we explore life after 60, emotional strength, and the quiet power of aging with grace. Nkaf Wisdomy World, because every chapter after 60 still holds meaning.